January 17, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The first light of dawn filtered through the palm fronds, casting long shadows across the coral airstrip. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya stood motionless beside his Zero fighter, his leather gloves stiff with salt from the humid air. Around him, mechanics worked in practiced silence, their movements economical, precise. The sound of wrenches on aluminum echoed across the tarmac like temple bells, methodical, rhythmic, ritualistic. He could smell aviation fuel mixing with the sweetness of jungle rot, that particular perfume of the South Pacific that had become as familiar as incense in a shrine. Itaya's fighter bore the scars of 37 combat missions. Patches covered bullet holes in the fuselage. The paint had faded from glossy imperial gray to something closer to ash. But the engine was sound, the controls responsive, and most importantly, his squadron still had fuel. Not much, never enough, but sufficient for today's patrol over the Solomon Sea, where American forces had been reported gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. He had been flying since Pearl Harbor. 14 months of war. In that time, he had seen the empire stretch across the Pacific like a rising sun. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. An ocean transformed into a Japanese lake. Victory after victory, each one swift, decisive, almost preordained. The Americans, they had been told, were soft, individualistic, undisciplined, a nation of merchants and movie stars who would sue for peace after the shock of Pearl Harbor demonstrated Japan's martial superiority. That morning in January 1943, as mechanics topped off his fuel tanks with precious gasoline hauled across thousands of miles of ocean, Itaya still believed this. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Japan had started the war with the finest carrier pilots in the world, men with thousands of hours of flight time, veterans of China, masters of their aircraft. The Americans had been caught unprepared, their Pacific fleet crippled, their pilots green and inexperienced. But there was something in the radio reports lately that troubled him. Something in the way the numbers refused to make sense. What Lieutenant Commander Ataya could not yet comprehend, what would transform his understanding of warfare and ultimately reshape the entire calculus of the Pacific conflict, was that he was about to witness not just a military campaign, but an industrial revelation. He was about to encounter an enemy that did not fight according to the ancient rules of attrition and exhaustion. An enemy that had weaponized something Japan could never match: the staggering, almost incomprehensible productive capacity of American industry. The war Japan thought it was fighting had already ended. The real war, the war of factories and shipyards, of training bases and supply chains, of mass production elevated to a philosophy of warfare itself, had only just begun. To understand what Ataya and thousands of Japanese aviators experienced in 1943 and 1904, one must first understand what they had been promised. The calculus of Japanese naval strategy rested on a theory of inevitable victory through superior skill and warrior spirit. Japan's naval pilots were the products of a brutal, exacting training system that produced excellence through elimination. Only the finest survived. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier pilots averaged between 600 and 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience over China. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter aircraft that outperformed anything the Allies possessed in the early war, more maneuverable, longer range, flown by men who treated their aircraft as extensions of their own bodies. The Americans, by contrast, fielded pilots with perhaps 200 hours of training, flying inferior aircraft like the Brewster Buffalo and the early variants of the Wildcat. The initial engagements proved Japanese assumptions correct. At Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots swept aside American resistance with contemptuous ease. American losses were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of the war, the United States lost 4 carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. Japanese strategic planning assumed this rate of attrition would continue. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, understood America's industrial potential better than most of his colleagues. But even he calculated that Japan needed only 18 months of victories to force a negotiated peace. The Americans would lose ships, planes, and pilots faster than they could replace them. The mathematics of exhaustion would compel a settlement. Japan would keep its conquered territories and establish its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was not mere hope, it was strategic doctrine, supported by historical precedent. No Western power had ever sustained a long war of attrition across the Pacific. But the doctrine contained a fatal assumption, that American production would follow normal patterns, that the United States would rebuild its military according to conventional peacetime schedules, that the Americans would fight a war of scarcity, like every other combatant nation in history. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. The transformation began not in battle, but in places like Willow Run, Michigan, and the sprawling Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. While Japanese pilots flew combat missions from jungle airstrips, carefully husbanding every aircraft, every drop of fuel, every spare part, the Americans were doing something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They were industrializing war itself. Consider the aircraft carrier, the capital ship of Pacific warfare, the platform from which all aerial combat flowed. When the war began, the United States had 7 carriers in the Pacific. By the end of 1942, 4 had been sunk or severely damaged. A traditional military analysis would suggest American carrier strength had been reduced by more than half. But in June 1942, even as the Battle of Midway raged, American shipyards were already laying keels for the Essex-class carriers, fast, modern ships built on an assembly line model borrowed from automobile manufacturing. The first Essex-class carrier was commissioned in December 1942, less than a year after its keel was laid. By the end of 1943, 6 more had joined the fleet. But the Essexes were only the beginning. American shipyards simultaneously produced dozens of smaller escort carriers, converted from merchant ship hulls, built in as little as 3 months each. These light carriers, derided by some as Kaiser coffins after their primary manufacturer, provided air cover for amphibious operations and anti-submarine patrols. They were not as glamorous or powerful as fleet carriers, but they could be produced at a rate of 1 per week at peak production. 1 per week. This was the mathematics that would break Japanese assumptions. This was the arithmetic of total industrial war. Lieutenant Commander Itaya first glimpsed this reality in the spring of 1943 during operations around Guadalcanal. His squadron had been ordered to intercept an American convoy reported to be moving through the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands. Intelligence estimated 3 escort carriers and perhaps 24 support vessels, a significant target but manageable. The Japanese attack group numbered 36 aircraft, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, the trinity of Japanese naval aviation. They found the convoy at midday, the American ships stretched across the turquoise water in a defensive formation. But as Itaya's squadron approached, the air erupted with fighters, not a handful, not the expected dozen, but what seemed like an infinite swarm. Wildcats climbing from the carriers below, then Corsairs and Hellcats, new aircraft types that Itaya barely recognized. The Americans had been expecting them. They had radar, a technology that gave them eyes beyond the horizon, and they had fighters to spare. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Of the 36 Japanese aircraft, 23 were shot down. Itaya survived, his Zero streaming coolant, 1 aileron shot away, barely making it back to Rabaul on fumes. Of the American convoy, when 1 destroyer had been damaged, the carriers continued on their course, unscathed. In the debriefing, Itaya and his surviving pilots tried to make sense of what they had encountered. The numbers did not align with any previous engagement. Where had all those American fighters come from? Intelligence had reported these carriers as newly commissioned, yet they operated with practiced coordination. Their pilots, supposedly inexperienced, fought with aggressive confidence. What Itaya could not know, what Japanese intelligence failed to comprehend, was that those American pilots were not the same men who had fought in 1942. They were not even direct replacements for losses. They were the product of an entirely new system of warfare. While Japan trained pilots through a process of selective attrition that took years, the United States had transformed flight training into an industrial process. Before the war, American military flight training produced perhaps a few hundred pilots per year. By 1943, the training establishment had expanded to produce 8,000 new pilots per month. Per month. This was not simply a matter of lowering standards. The Americans had systematized the entire process of creating a combat aviator. At Pensacola and dozens of other training bases, flight instruction had been broken down into specific, measurable skills. Instructors used standardized curricula. Training aircraft were mass-produced. Simulators, crude by later standards but revolutionary for their time, allowed pilots to practice procedures without consuming fuel or risking aircraft. The entire system operated like a vast machine, processing young men from civilian life through primary training, basic flight school, advanced combat tactics, and finally to operational squadrons. But mere numbers told only part of the story. The Americans had solved a problem that seemed impossible: how to make inexperienced pilots survivable in combat. The answer lay in a combination of technology, tactics, and mass. First, technology. American aircraft designers abandoned the Japanese philosophy of lightweight, maneuverable fighters. Instead, they built aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, heavier, less agile, but powerfully armed and crucially armored. American pilots flew the aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks, armored seats, and redundant systems. A Zero could outturn a Hellcat, but a Zero hit by a burst of .50 caliber fire would burn. A Hellcat would absorb the damage and bring its pilot home. This fundamental design philosophy reflected American abundance. Japanese engineers minimized weight to maximize performance, accepting vulnerability as necessary. American engineers added weight to maximize survivability, relying on powerful engines, themselves products of American industrial capacity, to maintain performance despite the added mass. Second, tactics. American squadron commanders developed fighting methods that leveraged their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. The Thak Weave, pioneered by Commander John Thak, allowed two American fighters to cover each other through mutual support, negating the Zero's superior maneuverability. American pilots were taught to avoid turning dogfights, instead using their aircraft's speed and diving ability to make slashing attacks. Boom and zoom, they called it. Dive from above, fire, extend away, climb, repeat. It was methodical, almost industrial in its efficiency. Third, mass. American carriers operated in groups, their fighter formations stacked in layers, high, medium, and low cover. They overwhelmed Japanese formations through sheer numbers. Even if individual American pilots were less skilled, collectively they created an environment where Japanese aces, the irreplaceable products of years of training, could be shot down by relatively inexperienced wingmen. By mid-1943, the exchange ratio had shifted dramatically. In 1942, Japanese pilots might shoot down 3 or 4 American aircraft for every Zero lost. By the summer of 1943, the ratio had reversed. American fighters were claiming 5, 6, even 10 Japanese aircraft for every loss. And because the Americans could replace their losses weekly, sometimes daily, while the Japanese could not, the arithmetic of attrition now worked entirely in America's favor. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese aviators was not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was something more prosaic, more psychologically devastating: the American lunchbox. In September 1943, Japanese forces overran a small American airfield on Vella La Vella in the Solomons. The Americans had evacuated only hours before, leaving behind supplies and equipment in their haste. Among the captured material, Japanese soldiers found an officer's mess tent, still stocked with provisions. The inventory was recorded by a quartermaster: canned fruit cocktail, condensed milk, coffee, chocolate bars, cigarettes, white bread, Spam, corned beef, powdered eggs, sugar, jam. This inventory made its way through Japanese command channels, eventually reaching naval headquarters at Truk. It seemed impossible. The Americans had been on Vella La Vella for less than 2 weeks, yet they had established a supply line capable of delivering not just ammunition and fuel, but luxury foods. Coffee, chocolate, items that had become scarce even in Tokyo. Compare this with the Japanese situation. By late 1943, frontline Japanese units were on reduced rations. Rice was supplemented with local vegetables. Meat was rare. Many Japanese positions were ordered to live off the land, a euphemism for near starvation conditions. The supply lines from Japan stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, now increasingly dominated by American submarines. Every ton of food transported to frontline units meant one less ton of ammunition, fuel, or spare parts. Yet the Americans seemed to have endless supplies of everything. This abundance was not accidental. It was strategic policy. American military planners understood that well-fed, well-supplied troops fought better, maintained morale longer, and retained effectiveness under stress. More than that, the ability to deliver not just necessities, but comforts to frontline units sent a message to American troops, to allies, and to enemies. It said, "We have so much industrial capacity that we can ship ice cream across the Pacific. We can bring chocolate to jungle islands. We have defeated distance itself." For Japanese pilots, flying long missions on reduced rations, often suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases, the knowledge of American abundance became psychologically corrosive. It suggested something that contradicted every premise of their training, that material superiority might matter more than fighting spirit, that a nation of merchants and factory workers might defeat a warrior culture through sheer industrial weight. The transformation in Japanese pilot perception became evident in their after-action reports and personal correspondence. Where early war reports had described American pilots as cowardly for avoiding close combat, later reports used different language. The language shift revealed a growing respect, even fear, of American capabilities. But more devastating than respect was the dawning realization that the war was unwinnable. Japanese pilots could see the arithmetic clearly. Every mission cost irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. Even successful missions merely delayed American advances. The Americans were not just replacing their losses, they were growing stronger. More carriers, more aircraft, better trained pilots. By 1944, Japanese pilots were encountering American formations that seemed to darken the sky. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, exemplified the complete reversal of fortunes. Japan launched 400 aircraft against American carriers. The Americans had fighters stacked in layers, guided by radar, vectored precisely to intercept the Japanese formations. Of the 400 Japanese aircraft, 350 were shot down. American losses, 29 aircraft, mostly to anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Commander Itoei survived that battle, though his aircraft did not. He ditched in the ocean and was rescued by a Japanese submarine. He reported that American fighters seemed to know exactly where his formation would be, arriving at altitude with speed and positional advantage. He estimated he had seen at least 200 American fighters. When intelligence officers questioned this number as impossible, Itoei simply repeated, 200. He was not exaggerating. The American task force had launched over 400 fighters that day. The mathematics that Japanese strategic planning had ignored now manifested as an aerial armada that simply overwhelmed any resistance. The final crushing element of American industrial warfare revealed itself in the replacement pipeline. When a Japanese pilot was killed, his experience died with him. Japan's training system could not quickly replace skilled aviators. By 1944, Japanese squadrons included pilots with as few as 40 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage in combat. These inexperienced pilots died in their first or second missions. The veteran aces who had survived since Pearl Harbor flew mission after mission, their odds of survival decreasing with each sortie until luck ran out. American losses, by contrast, flowed into a replacement system that seemed infinite. A carrier would lose 10 pilots in combat. Within 2 weeks, 10 replacement pilots would arrive, often with more training than the men they replaced, because the training system had continued to improve. These replacements flew aircraft that were newer, better equipped, incorporating lessons learned from combat only months before. Consider the numbers. In 1942, the United States produced approximately 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, 85,000. In 1944, 96,000. Japan's peak production was 28,000 in 1944, But by then, aluminum shortages forced manufacturers to use inferior materials. Late-war Japanese fighters sometimes included wooden components, while American aircraft were increasingly sophisticated, incorporating radar, advanced radio equipment, and guided weapons. The disparity extended beyond aircraft to every category of war material. While Japanese factories struggled to produce a handful of carriers, American shipyards launched dozens. While Japanese oil supplies dwindled under submarine attack, American tankers delivered endless streams of fuel. While Japanese pilots flew until their aircraft disintegrated from stress and poor maintenance, American pilots transitioned to newer aircraft types, leaving the old ones for training units. This was not simply industrial advantage. This was industrial dominance so complete that it transformed warfare itself. The Americans had weaponized their economy. Every factory was a strategic asset. Every shipyard was a force multiplier. Every training base was a production line for combat power. In January 1945, exactly 2 years after that morning at Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Ataya found himself on another airstrip, this time on Formosa. He had been promoted to squadron commander, though the title meant little now. His squadron consisted of 7 aircraft, 4 of which were barely flyable. His pilots averaged 90 hours of flight time. They had fuel for perhaps one more mission. American carrier strikes had been hitting Formosa daily. Wave after wave of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers, so many aircraft that Japanese defenders had stopped counting. They simply launched whatever aircraft could fly and hoped to damage something, anything, before being shot down. Ataya's orders were to participate in special attack operations. Kamikaze. It was, the order stated, the only way to achieve favorable exchange ratios against American naval power. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, for 1 American ship. The mathematics of desperation. He stood beside his aircraft, no longer a Zero, those were gone, but a repurposed training plane pressed into combat service, and watched the sun rise through the haze of smoke from burning oil tanks hit by yesterday's raid. The sound he heard was not the controlled precision of mechanics preparing aircraft for combat. It was improvisation, desperation, the sound of an air force held together with salvaged parts and willpower. 2 years earlier, he had believed in certain victory. The mathematics had seemed clear. Japan had better pilots, better aircraft, superior fighting spirit. The Americans would be exhausted, defeated, forced to negotiate. Every Japanese strategic calculation had been built on this foundation. But the Americans had not played by those rules. They had not accepted attrition. They had not exhausted themselves. Instead, they had simply produced more. More ships, more planes, more pilots, more of everything, until Japanese resistance became numerically impossible. Ataya thought about the American lunchbox, found on some forgotten island, stocked with luxuries. He thought about the endless streams of American aircraft, the replacement pilots who kept coming, better trained than the men before them. He thought about the carriers appearing in numbers that should have been impossible, and he understood, finally, what he was fighting. Not an enemy army or navy, not individual pilots or ships, but an industrial civilization that had mobilized its entire economy for war, that treated warfare as a problem of production, that replaced losses not with equivalents, but with improvements. Japan had brought a warrior culture to fight an industrial titan. Valor could not overcome volume. Spirit could not defeat steel. Tradition could not compete with innovation. The mathematics had never been in Japan's favor. They had simply refused to do the calculation correctly. The American aircraft that appeared over Formosa that morning came in formations so large they seemed to merge into a single mass, a cloud of aluminum and fire that stretched from horizon to horizon. Itaya's makeshift squadron launched to intercept them, 7 aircraft against hundreds. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 5 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 2 retreated with heavy damage. No American aircraft were lost. Ataya's plane was among those destroyed, hit by a Hellcat flown by Ensign Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old from Michigan who had graduated from flight school just 11 weeks earlier. It was Riley's first combat kill. He would survive the war, return to Michigan, and work in an automobile factory for 40 years. He never spoke much about the war except to say that he had been lucky. Lucky to have good equipment, lucky to have good training, lucky to have been born in a country that could produce fighters faster than enemies could destroy them. That word, lucky, understated the truth. Riley had not been lucky. He had been the beneficiary of a systematic advantage so vast it appeared to Japanese eyes as luck, or fate, or divine will. But it was none of those things. It was production. It was industrial capacity translated into combat power. It was the arithmetic of total war, calculated in factories and shipyards and training bases across a continent that Japanese planners had fatally underestimated. In the years after the war, historians would study the Japanese-American conflict through many lenses: tactical, strategic, technological. But perhaps the most important lens is the one that Japanese pilots like Ataya lived through but could never fully articulate: the confrontation between two completely different philosophies of warfare. Japan fought a war of quality: elite pilots, beautifully engineered aircraft, highly trained specialists pushed to the limits of human capability. It was warfare as art, as expression of cultural values, as manifestation of warrior spirit. Every pilot was irreplaceable. Every aircraft was precious. Resources were finite, to be used carefully, strategically, with maximum efficiency. America fought a war of quantity: mass-produced aircraft, systematically trained pilots, overwhelming industrial capacity translated directly into combat power. It was warfare as industry, as logistics, as applied economics. Pilots were replaceable, aircraft were expendable, resources were effectively infinite, to be used liberally, overwhelmingly, with maximum volume. When these two philosophies collided, the outcome was foreordained. Not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, they possessed both in abundance. Not because Japanese aircraft were inferior, the Zero remained formidable throughout the war. But because in total war between industrial powers, production capacity becomes the ultimate weapon. The side that can replace its losses faster, train new pilots better, develop new technologies more quickly, and sustain operations at greater scale will inevitably prevail. They had expected to annihilate American forces through superior skill and fighting spirit. Instead, they were annihilated by American factories that produce warriors on assembly lines, carriers on shipyard ways, and ammunition by the trainload. They were defeated not by any single battle or brilliant strategy, but by the grinding, inexorable mathematics of industrial war. There is a museum in Japan, in the city of Kure, where the great battleship Yamato was built. Among the exhibits is a small display case containing items recovered from captured American positions: a tin of peaches, a coffee can, a pack of Chesterfield cigarettes, a Hershey bar. Visitors often pause at this case longer than at the displays of swords and aircraft engines and battle flags. Because these mundane items, food and coffee and tobacco, represent something more profound than weapons. They represent the industrial and logistical capability that won the Pacific War. They represent a society so wealthy, so productive, so efficiently organized, that it could deliver not just the necessities of war, but the comforts of peace to soldiers fighting on islands 8,000 miles from home. The chocolate bar speaks louder than the bombs. The coffee can testify more powerfully than the carriers, because they prove that American victory was not contingent on individual battles or tactical brilliance or even technological advantage. It was structural. It was foundational. It was the inevitable result of a fully mobilized industrial democracy fighting a war of production against an empire that had never understood what such a war would require. Japanese pilots expected easy victories because they had misunderstood what they were fighting. They thought they were fighting American soldiers and sailors and pilots. They were actually fighting American factories, American farms, American mines and mills, and shipyards and training bases. They were fighting an economy that could produce aircraft faster than they could shoot them down, carriers faster than they could sink them, pilots faster than they could kill them. And so they lost. Not in a single climactic battle, but in 1,000 small defeats. Each down zero that was never replaced. Each veteran pilot killed and replaced with an undertrained novice. each mission flown with inadequate fuel and failing equipment, while American formations grew larger and better equipped. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one inflicted by the grinding wheels of industrial production. In the end, the Japanese pilots who survived, a small percentage of those who had flown in 1941, understood a truth that their government had been unwilling to accept. That modern warfare between industrial powers is decided not in the sky or on the sea or on the battlefield, but in the factory. The side that builds more, faster, better will prevail. The arithmetic is merciless. The mathematics are absolute. They expected easy victories. Instead, they received an education in industrial warfare that came at the cost of an empire and the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men who climbed into cockpits believing that spirit and skill could overcome steel and numbers. They were wrong, the numbers always win.